moved my top 5 list, and it's inspired by, when I was going through all of my research on how often, the largest retirement classes we've had in midterm elections. And I was reminded that as large, the fact that we'd crossed 50 retirements, and it was only the third time we'd ever done it. The 2 times in midterms, right? 2018, we had 55. We're at 51 and counting now for 2026. But the high water mark was 1992. That was a presidential year. And it was 65. And if you recall, I said, there were sort of 3 things that were driving so many retirements that cycle. One is it was a redistricting year, and it was no ordinary redistricting year. It was the first cycle where the Justice Department prioritized majority minority reapportionment. So in the South, it guaranteed a lot more African-American representation, and in the Southwest, Latino representation. And the Justice Department was approving or disapproving these maps based on that. Well, that really shook up a lot of different maps, drove a lot of retirements. The second thing that drove a bunch of incumbents into retirement was scandal. And that there was a couple of unique, they were basically members of Congress were able to write checks without having to prove they had the cash to do it, like this special house bank, and members were bouncing checks, or some guys bounced over 700 checks, and it was just crazy. There was also a House post office scandal where people were getting free postage, members of Congress free postage, and then somehow like parlaying it into cash elsewhere. It's what was the downfall of one Dan Rostenkowski, the one-time powerful chairman, the Ways and Means Committee, an old Chicago Democrat. But there was a third reason that drove a bunch of incumbents into retirement, and that was 1992 was going to be the last year a sitting member of Congress, House or Senate, could retire and take whatever leftover campaign money they had and convert it to personal finances. They could just take whatever campaign money was left, and it was theirs. They didn't have to give it back to donors. They didn't have to, give it to the party, give it to a PAC, or open up their own PAC and create a political committee. They could simply just convert it to their own. And so quite a few members had, at the time, having $1 million in your account was a huge deal back then. Thought, hey, I got this brand new retirement account, in addition to their congressional pension. I remember South Florida lost 3, I think, long-time, or at least 2 long-time members of Congress. And I can't help but wonder how much that contributed to it. Bill Layman and Dante Fascell were 2 of the guys that took off in 92. Claude Pepper kept going. He could have probably walked away with money. But he had already passed away. I admit, Claude Pepper by 90. My bad on that. Claude Pepper was 80. He passed away in 89. But you had, I think, 2 other members who chose not to seek re-election, and one of the perks of that. So it made me think, what would be good? A top 5 list of, you won't believe this used to be legal in American politics. And it's just a good reminder that reform is always reactive in American politics. We don't outlaw abuses in advance. We don't think about what could be abused. We wait for the abuse to happen. Then we pass a law or regulation to try to prevent it in the future. So with that in mind, here's my top 5 list of things that were once completely legal, followed by a second list that may someday make future Americans say, wait, they allowed that? So top 5 things that used to be legal, but no longer are. And it'll shock you that this was. So number 5, corporations could give directly to candidates. This was legal until 1907 and the passage of the Tillman Act. But back then, there were no PACs. Corporations didn't need PACs or shell entities to get money to candidates. They simply wrote checks directly from corporate treasuries to candidates. In fact, Mark Hanna, who was sort of the political guru of William McKinley, in the turn of the century. In the 1896 and 1900 elections, Mark Hanna, while running the McKinley campaigns, he didn't ask corporations for donations. He assigned them quotas. Railroads, banks, manufacturers, they were told what they owed based on what he thought was the stake in prosperity. Hey, You have to give this much money to our campaign. And then it sort of blew up when Standard Oil, it was at the time, it was exposed that they secretly funded Teddy Roosevelt's 1904 campaign. And when that came out, Teddy was so embarrassed, not because it was illegal, but because it looked bad, that he actually got behind the reform that became the Tillman Act that did this. Now, of course, we have dark money. You've got people that can make their donations anonymous, and there's certainly plenty of shell companies now that can be used in shell 501c3s and 4s and stuff like that. But believe it or not, back in the day, it was not just legal. You had campaigns that essentially invoiced. That's what Mark Hanna did. He invoiced railroad companies and oil companies for those 1896 and 1900 campaigns. Number 4 on the list, party machines openly bought votes. This was legal for much of the 19th century. Vote buying wasn't hidden. It was simply transactional. So you'd have Tammany Hall operatives. They would just be handing out cash, coal, turkeys, whiskey right outside of polling places. This was in New York City. Ballots back then were public. So party bosses could actually know how someone voted. And if you took the money and voted the wrong way, you didn't get paid the next time. So basically, that's how we ended up with the secret ballot. And it's a reminder, secret ballots, they don't make politics moral. It just makes it made the corruption unenforceable on that front. The number 3, you won't believe this was legal. Federal jobs being used as campaign currency. This was legal until 1883. So before we had civil service reform, and frankly, it's something that Donald Trump's trying to undo today. But federal employment up until 1883 was basically a spoils system. Presidents would fire entire post office staffs after election, and the Postal Service back then was seen as part of the political arm of presidents and political parties. That, frankly, that was all the way through until FDR. FDR's chief political strategist was the postmaster general. That wasn't an accident, because post offices were all over the country. They were essentially little organizing hubs. At least that's how they saw them, until they finally sort of separated out and took the politics out of the Postal Service. But before 1883, you'd see just entire post offices would turn over if the political party of the president changed, and they were all replaced with loyalists. Federal employees would actually be subjected to political assessment, something Donald Trump's trying to do right now with civil servants, right? And there would be mandatory kickbacks were expected. And if you didn't pay, you lost your job. And it took the assassination of James Garfield for a former party boss or party operative in Chester Arthur to see the light. And he helped, as president, lead to this civil service reform that's actually served the country quite well. Until Doge and until what Trump's trying to do now, where they're trying to repoliticize the federal government. I promise you, the corruption of the 19th century, which was huge in government, would come right back if we got rid of these civil service reforms. Number 2 on that list is candidates could accept unlimited anonymous cash. This was legal until essentially Watergate. So before we ever had any modern campaign finance law, there was no disclosure requirements and no limits. So wealthy donors literally could give bags of cash to presidential campaigns with no public reporting. Campaigns literally kept cash safes. Okay? Envelopes stuffed with money moved through hotel rooms, private offices, and voters, none of us had any right to know who was funding the campaigns or asking for their vote. Essentially, democracy functioned as a blind trust, and that blind trust failed miserably. It took Watergate and Nixon for it to happen. But look, it was bags of cash. Nobody knows how much money John Kennedy's dad spent. We still don't know how much he spent. We have no idea how much money was spent on behalf of Eisenhower, how much money FDR spent on his own campaigns, all of those things. At least now we have the laws to do that. And then, of course, number 1, I can't believe it was legal, is what I was telling you about, that retiring members of Congress could simply pocket their leftover campaign money. For decades, when members retired, all campaign contributions were seen as personal property. Retirement lawmakers simply converted the campaign accounts into personal income or retirement money. There was no requirement to donate it, refund it, or justify it. And there's no doubt in 92, which is why we had the record-breaking amount of retirements, still the record, because that was the last time they could take their leftover campaign balances and do that. So, which leads me into essentially a second top 5 list. And this is my top 5 list of things that are legal today that perhaps a future version of me, the AI version of me 50 years from now will do this top 5 list of, believe it or not, this stuff was legal. And frankly, if some of this becomes illegal sooner rather than later, we may have Donald Trump to thank. This episode of the ToddCast is being brought to you by Quince. As you know, a well-built wardrobe is about the pieces that work together, hold up over time, and frankly, allow you to be flexible and sort of business casual to, say, social casual. Well, Quince does this really well. They have premium material, thoughtful design, and some everyday staples that feel easy to wear, easy to rely on, even as the weather shifts. I've got some sweaters from Quince. I love them. I can use them for here on the podcast. I can do a business meeting with them. They have everyday essentials. I love the quality. So far, it's lasting really well. I've had it for a while. They have organic cotton sweaters, polos for every occasion. They have some nice jackets that you'd like, including, lighter jackets as things, I hope, warm up at some point down here in the Mid-Atlantic. The list goes on. They only partner with factories that meet some rigorous standards for craftsmanship and ethical production. Bottom line, I wear it. I'm happy. It's been really good. It's been quality. And again, it isn't gonna break the bank, okay? And it comes pretty quickly. I didn't have to wait weeks for this to come. So, refresh your wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/Chuck for free shipping on your order and a 365-day opportunity to return it. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/Chuck. Free shipping, 365-day returns. Quince.com/Chuck. Top 5 things that are still legal that I think are not going to age well. Number 5, members of Congress trading stocks, right? We've been seeing this back and forth about the stock trading ban. The amount of insider info an average member of Congress can get and can make decisions. We saw this during the pandemic. They'd get some COVID briefings, and all of a sudden you had members of Congress shorting some places, buying other places. Members of Congress, because they, will sometimes get access to funding, but it's all parts of the federal government, people in the Defense Department, government contractors. So this is clearly a potential loophole. And I don't see, I know that the argument says, well, and the problem is, right, Congress is sitting there going, why do we have to play by one set of rules while Donald Trump's going to play by no rules? And how you apply this across government, I think, is quite difficult. Ultimately, we probably need a constitutional amendment when it comes to, and probably just saying that, when you're in an office of public trust, federal office, you can't, you got to put in a blind trust. You got to do maybe monthly reports. I'm not saying people are still going to find ways, perhaps, a crook's going to crook, but if you create more friction in that process, create more accountability windows in that process, you're at least going to minimize. And at that point, perhaps shame and sunshine will remind voters. But the fact that voters right now, and especially, you could have said 40 years ago there weren't that many people trading in the stock market. That's not the case anymore. And it does feel, look, we already know there are plenty of members of Congress who suddenly end up purchasing land that they get to decide what becomes an exit on a federal interstate, and then suddenly that land is worth more money. That stuff's been happening a long time. That's a little bit harder to police. Stock trading is a little simpler to do, and it seems like, I do think this is going to get some momentum, especially as there are more and more. This feels like it's one of those that the left and the right are gonna that's one of those that you're going to see a convergence on that one. Number 4, Leadership packs. Right now, leadership packs are essentially little lifestyle slush funds for members of Congress. Leadership packs, they can pay for luxury travel, high-end restaurants, expensive hotels. You can create a family payroll, and it all can be labeled as political activity. Hey, I've got to, go do this fundraiser in Puerto Rico. I'll have my leadership pack pay for this nice resort, and we'll have some great dinners. And um, it basically became the loophole, since you couldn't turn your campaign account into personal funds. These leadership packs became sort of the loophole for that. They're ripe for abuse, and it's pretty clear that there needs to be more accountability to them, not less. Lobbyist bundling. The fact that a single lobbyist right now can gather 20 or 30 maxed out checks from clients and then deliver them in one fell swoop, signaling influence within that industry, right? Without breaking contribution limits. So a PAC can help get you $1 million in contributions, even if it's $2,500 at a time. And creating the fact that is, and again, I think bundling is hard to police. I'm not going to tell you I have an easy way to come up with a regulation that could that could do this, but just I think a lot of this stuff could probably be solved with obsessive um, transparency, at least where people you force sort of the NASCAR effect. You force people to have to show what they're doing, who's giving, and how much they're giving at any one time. This is one that flies under the radar, that sitting members of Congress can negotiate private sector jobs while still voting on legislation that might have an impact on their future private sector employment. So, for instance, and we've seen this, right? We saw Mark Green, who was a member of Congress in Tennessee. He seemed to be negotiating, figuring out his private sector future. He ends up eventually resigning, but he was clearly in the middle of doing it, then got exposed that he was doing it, and then finally decided to quit quickly. The fact that it's legal to negotiate future jobs with industries that are affected by legislation they're currently voting on. Right now, they've put in a cooling off period, but it only starts after you leave office. There probably ought to be just a I don't. It's sort of like you get expelled, you lose your pension, like, some penalty if you get caught negotiating for a job while you're a sitting member of Congress and voting on that industry, right? That you got to have some sort of disclosure. I'm doing this. Maybe you don't have to make it public, but maybe to the House Ethics Office or something. Because most of the time, the conflict that right now, it's the cooling. We've worried about former lawmakers going right into lobbying, and there's cooling off periods for that. But it's the negotiating while you're voting where it becomes potentially corruptible. And of course, the number one thing that is legal in this country that frankly is a mistake that from the creation of this great republic, and that is the presidential pardon power. The fact that presidents can pardon political allies, donors, family members, potential witnesses, even preemptively, with no transparency, no review, no limits. I think I think it was outrageous that Joe Biden issued those sort of pardons before anything was happening. And it's even more outrageous that every week Donald Trump seems to essentially sell pardons and give pardons out to people who are either political allies or financial benefactors. But it is clearly a huge gap in our system. It's going to take a constitutional amendment to get rid of the presidential pardon. Now, I think that there's a way to reform it. You create a pardon board. Maybe there's 2 members of congressional leadership, 2 Supreme Court justices, maybe the 2 most senior Supreme Court justices, plus maybe the Attorney General, President, Vice President, something like that. You can create a pardon board where you still have some, but it's got to go through a vetting process and some sort of process there. It is, because right now I think we've seen it's the greatest loophole that sits in the Constitution for a president to abuse. And we probably have a president right now that is abusing the pardon power at a rate that no other president has even come close to. So there you go. My top 5 lists of things you wouldn't believe used to be legal, and my top 5 list of things I can't believe are still legal. This episode of the ToddCast is brought to you by American Financing. Let's be honest, the math just isn't adding up lately. Between the grocery store and those skyrocketing insurance premiums, even with a steady job, more families are being forced to rely on high-interest credit cards to cover expenses. So if you're a homeowner caught in this cycle, carrying balances with interest rates in the 20s, frankly, even the 30s, it's time to get some relief. Right now, mortgage rates are at a 3-year low. And my friends at American Financing are helping homeowners pay off that high-interest debt at rates in the low 5s. Their salary-based mortgage consultants don't just push loans on you. They build exit strategies from debt. On average, they're saving their customers $800 a month. So, if you start today, you may even delay the next 2 mortgage payments. There are no upfront fees or obligations. To find out how much you can save, America's home for home loans is American Financing. 866-885-1081. That's 866-885-1081 or AmericanFinancing.net/the ToddCast. Important disclaimer, NMLS 182334, NMLS consumeraccess.org. APR for rates in the 5s start at 6.196% for well-qualified buyers. Call 866-885-1081 for details about credit costs and terms, or AmericanFinancing.net/the ToddCast.